So I'm going to be talking today with Laura, and me and Laura met a couple of years ago, where I introduced her to the journals and what they do for mental health. And Laura specialises in the menopause, the change of life, and the nutrition that goes along with that. But I will let you explain a little bit more about what you do and the work that you do.
My background is I'm a registered dietitian, so I have been one of those now for more years than I care to remember, which means that that places me into very much my peer group going through perimenopause and transitioning through that phase of life. I think as we age, nutrition is a really key component of our health, but it's only one part of a much bigger puzzle. And the work that I do enables me to bring nutritional science into the conversation, but to also put that in the context of our behaviours and habits and why we do what we do and why we feel what we feel about our bodies and our relationship to food. And I learned very early on in my career that knowledge around nutrition is not enough to change someone's behaviour. We have to understand that we're much more complex than that. And it's really important that we take into account someone's lived experience, which by the time we enter into our menopausal years is going to be a fair few decades. We need to understand that. We need to work within that to really support someone to achieve optimal health and well-being, and really take into account that nutrition is such an important part of that, but it has to be done alongside our relationship to rest, how we regulate our emotional health, how we move, and how we connect with other people. All of these things are so important. So my work brings in all of those components together to help that woman on that journey through menopause, and to advocate for her health and well-being from all angles.
So, are there any kind of symptoms that you've come across that are what you would consider typical or atypical?
For somebody who has an awareness of their mental health and is wanting to take care of that, it isn't until recently that we've started to notice that menopausal women have for a number of years been prescribed antidepressants as a result of being perimenopausal, but that not really being picked up. So they've gone to the GP and said, I feel low in mood, depressed, more anxious, and the GP has gone down the antidepressant route. So I think it doesn't make sense to overwhelm a woman with, a whole page of possible menopausal symptoms. I think it would be useful probably to kind of theme them. So we would perhaps want to say that estrogen plays a role in our bone and joint health. So these are some of the side effects of having less estrogen. So, for example, stiffness in joints is a symptom. Estrogen plays a big role in our brain health and function. So you might notice that you have more cravings for carbohydrate. You might notice that your energy levels are low, that you have got problems with temperature regulation. So that's obviously, like you said, the classic hot flushes and night sweats. But also it plays a role in cognitive function. So brain fog, lack of concentration, that kind of thing. So it might be quite nice to sort of group them. There is no definitive number of symptoms that we can say these are all of the symptoms that someone might have as a result of the menopause. Well, they wouldn't have all of those symptoms, no. But some lists will have 30 of them, some lists might have 40, 50, there's a bit of a lack of consensus around that. And I'm not sure, as I say, like a massive sort of list of symptoms, which when you read it is quite frankly quite horrifying, is helpful unless we're able to give it a bit of a sense of structure and not detract from why they're using that journal in the first place, if that makes sense.
And I want to make sure that this has a very clear mental health angle, because there are a lot of symptoms relating to the menopause that are typical, that you do expect, and that you can see visually.
Yeah.
However, there is a huge amount under the surface that's going on with mental health, and that's what I want to tap into, is women being able to kind of not only know their own baseline in terms of their mental health, but in relation to menopause, what is unusual and what is not unusual, like levels of anxiety, depressive stages, because you are talking about a huge change of life that is as comparable as puberty. And we all remember how horrifying that was.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's puberty backwards.
Yeah.
Basically. And may well be in households of people doing puberty forwards. So it's, it's a potentially quite challenging scenario. But I think I would probably frame it as, where does perimenopause fit into the mental health equation? That's kind of what we're saying, isn't it? Because if somebody, as we said, has already got mental health on their radar, to be already engaging with your product and support through the journaling resources that you've got, we kind of want them to be ahead of the game. We want them to be aware that perimenopause is a part of that jigsaw puzzle. So I think the main focus is on how it affects our mood and mental health, and things that have a knock-on effect on that, like energy levels and pain and that sort of thing. But that, we kind of come at it from that angle, as opposed to, oh, let's talk to you about menopause and here's all these symptoms. And, it kind of gets lost in the small print that mental health is a part of that.
The menopause can go on for a very, very long time. I don't think many people realise that the menopause, it's not just for some people a year, it can go on for a decade. And if you are confused for an entire decade, you're not going, your anxiety triggers and causes may have been different 10 years ago than they are now.
Yeah.
And how do you keep an eye on that? Because you can't just say, oh, this is what triggers me, and that's going to stay the same, and I'm just going to work on that thing. Because by the time you get to 5 years, 10 years through menopause, it could be completely different. So I think being able to have a resource that you can use maybe once a month or whenever you'd like to, and you can look back and you can compare, okay, well, this was making me anxious previously. It's no longer doing that now, but this now is.
Yeah, and that's something that you hear reported a lot, that things, tasks, activities that previously they wouldn't have had an issue with or even considered, now are a problem and present anxiety for them. And again, if we have no insight into what's causing that, our instinct, is to judge, isn't it? Is to kind of get cross with ourselves. Why am I not wanting to drive on the motorway? I've always driven on the motorway. Why have I, it's stopping me now from getting to this thing that I really want to do? And then the self-criticism will rank up. There's just so many things, there's so much baggage that these women entering into perimenopause, getting weight gain, are experiencing. And I think we've got to kind of just give them an opportunity to reflect on all of that and to go, do you know what, this isn't black and white. This isn't a blame thing. This isn't your fault. This isn't something that you absolutely have control over. There's an element of this that's not within our conscious control, a huge element that's not within our conscious control. So that's the scene I think that we need to set, so that they're reflecting, but we're encouraging them to reflect with compassion, because we're saying this stuff is actually really complicated.
when you're talking about the change of life, you know, you are talking about a physical change as well. And I think mental health plays a huge role in that, because you're looking in the mirror and you're not necessarily seeing not only the person that have been used to seeing for 30, 40, 50 years, but you now might be seeing a version of yourself that you don't necessarily like or recognize. Women especially have had so much pressure put on them through hundreds of years to look a certain way, to conform to a certain appearance, and then to spend your whole life trying to achieve that, only to look in the mirror and find out, oh, that I'm not, this is different. I don't know how to move this body. I don't know what this body feels like. It doesn't feel how I was expecting it to feel.
Yeah.
And those kind of concerns, but that's a really delicate area to approach, I think.
Because I think a lot of the challenge that these women face is that they feel like they're so alone with that they are seeing their body change. They don't like what's happening. They feel unable to control that. And we know physiologically that the fluctuation in hormones and the lowering of the reproductive hormones will change where our body distributes fat. It will change our body composition. So we know that we will lose lean muscle mass and we will gain fat mass. And yet we live in a culture that continually tells us that if you try hard enough and you eat less and you move more and you give yourself a good talking to, that you can absolutely mould your body into whatever shape you desire. And diet culture is fierce. And women who have been subjected to diet culture their entire lives are going to be even more susceptible to the clutches of it as they enter into perimenopause, because it can be really triggering if they've learnt that weight is a measure of health, if they've learnt that weight is a measure of their value and self-worth, and they've spent 20, 30 years battling to keep their weight into, you know, what society would determine was, you know, conforming with the picture of health. And then they enter into their 40s and their body starts to change, and it's happening almost sort of, you know, out of their control. So most of the women that I work with will say, I didn't really change anything in terms of my exercise and eating habits, and yet my body, I'm gaining weight, my body shape is changing, and it's literally happening in front of my eyes, and I don't have any control over that. So I think part of this conversation and what we're hoping to kind of open up this conversation around is that body changing is normal, and encouraging those women to reflect on what their lived experience has taught them about what that then means. We hold so much fear around weight gain. We're taught that gaining weight is a bad thing, and it's dangled in front of us that this is all a health conversation. So the diet industry will say, you know, you need to lose weight because you aren't healthy. We have absolutely no evidence that weight and health are as closely linked as they're made out to be, because weight fundamentally is not a behaviour. So actually, when you look at studies that say, oh, this person lost weight and then, you know, their health outcome improved. Well, was it the weight loss, or was it the fact that they did more exercise, or they changed their diet and they ate more fruit and veg and they cut down on animal fat, or whatever it might be? We actually haven't got the data to prove anything other than a correlation between weight and health outcome. So there's so much misinformation that is presented to us over the decades as absolute fact, that if you are in a larger body size, you are automatically unhealthy or unhealthier than someone in a smaller body size. That's just not true. So I think we're not going to change the world, but we are wanting to open that conversation to say this stuff is actually really complicated, and you will have held on to beliefs and been taught things as fact that actually are not fact. And if you are noticing that your body is anxious and fearful because it's changing shape, and that's creating that that physical sensation for you, but also the mental load of what that means, let's look at that. Where's that fear coming from? What's the belief held there? Is it that, well, I absolutely cannot be seen to be getting bigger because I'm damaging my health? That might be one belief, but there'll also be a belief held on to, well, if I get bigger, I am less worthy, I am less attractive, I am seen by others to be not as in control. And we know how far back this goes. You were talking about hundreds of years, like it is, right? Women have been taught that to survive in this world, we need men, and men are going to find us more attractive if we look a certain way. And we know in our sort of grandmothers and great grandmothers' generation that it was absolutely the done thing, that you really should eat as little as possible. And if you were able to survive on less food than your friend over here, that you were therefore morally more virtuous. You were a better person because you were demonstrating an element of willpower or whatever. We've got all of these convoluted beliefs held around what we need to be doing from a food behaviour perspective to keep us in these bodies, that actually it's not very sustainable and it's not very doable. And there's such a correlation between women saying, well, when I met my husband, I gained weight. And actually, when you think about that, is that actually because the dietary regimen that you were forcing yourself to comply with when you were, not with someone else, actually, as soon as you go into the practicalities of just, living life and living with another individual, it's just not achievable to keep following that type of diet.
And it is drilled into us. It's not just drilled into us by generations or by parents or by friends. It is the media, it is television, it's the things we're watching, listening to. And I mean, when you get to your kind of 40s, 50s and those type of stages, you are undoing behaviours that you have been learning since childhood. So it's not going to be easy. And I think with everything, prevention is always going to help. This is something that can't be prevented, but the earlier you're building that confidence in yourself, the earlier you're managing your anxieties and your mental health, the better going into that process is going to be, because it's going to be less of a shock to the system. I haven't ever been diagnosed with an eating disorder. It doesn't mean that, a couple of years ago when I lost some weight, I didn't feel better. And I felt better not because I saved money on buying clothes or that I even particularly looked better or I was more attractive, or I felt more attractive. It was what you were talking about, that sense of being worthy. It was like I'd achieved something monumental. And the confidence that came with it was, unlike anything that I'd experienced before, that self-confidence. But then I kind of got myself stuck into a place which is now I have to keep it off to maintain this feeling. So I know that the self-worth and the anxiety and all of those things are not tied into the weight loss. They're tied into me. And they're tied into how I think about myself and how I think other people perceive me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the problem isn't so much, I need to lose weight or I need to maintain my weight. It suddenly becomes, I need to be okay with myself. And that's a much bigger,
absolutely,
thing to tackle.
And this is it. And I come across this all the time in my clinics, because people initially will reach out to someone like myself because they want to lose weight. I must lose weight. There's a real, there's a fear that's coming from those messages because they get a sense that whatever they're doing is not working. And it's a really difficult conversation to have, but it's a really worthwhile one, because it is about saying, why is there a fear around that? That's what we need to look at. What are you making your weight mean about you? Because this has been with you your whole life. It's not a coincidence that the people who struggle the most with weight gain are those that have struggled with it their whole life. And most of my clients began dieting or were taken to diet clubs when they were 11, 12, 13 sort of age, and for a lot of them, it's so normalised in society to have a disordered eating relationship. And I think we've got to be really clear on that. Like you said, we're not talking about eating disorders, although that applies to many women. But there is a whole subsection of the population who have disordered eating that is completely normalised by the diet industry. And the wheels fall off, when we're in this perimenopausal phase. We've just worked our way through. We've done X number of diets. We've shifted the weight after we've had baby number 1, baby number 2, whatever. And there is something about the added dimension of the hormonal flux and all of these other symptoms that can present that just sends these women into an absolute spin.
I probably do have disordered eating because I've kept the weight off that I've lost, but now I am kind of, how many calories are in that? How many calories are in that? If I eat that, then I'm going to have to eat less tomorrow. And I don't mean to do it.
And like you said, ingrained.
It's all wrapped up in that kind of, this is the way I want to be healthy.
Yeah, I think this speaks to two striking questions, which is, how do you feel in your body and how do you feel about your body? Because we are so paranoid about how we feel about our bodies and how other people feel about our bodies, that we actually don't stop to think about how we feel in them. So, as an example, I had a client who was exactly as I've described, so very much trapped in this, perpetual body hatred over the years, many attempts to, change body shape, numerous life events that then, made it very difficult for her to continue said plan or whatever, many other factors that have influenced her eating habits and her relationship with food. And everything she was doing, weight was absolutely front and centre. The weight loss is my absolute focus, because from there, all of these other positive things will happen, right? And that's really normal. And then it wasn't until we had a conversation in which we said, right, what are we making this weight mean? Why does it have such a charge? What is it? What's going on here? And we kind of explored that for a little bit. And then we said, right, let's just park that for a minute and let's talk about health and let's talk about how you feel in your body. And we were able to decipher that actually she's got absolutely no evidence that she's unhealthy. She's physically fit. She has exercise that she does. She's got, happy emotional fitness. There are no red flags that she is unhealthy, either physically or mentally. And yet when we then started to think, well, what is it? What is it about your body? What's going on? How do you feel in your body? She said, well, in my body, I feel tired and I'm really bloated. And so then we were able to take it down a conversation of, okay, well, let's look at bloating, which is a symptom of menopause. Let's actually get very practical about what's contributing to that bloating and what are the things that we can look at in terms of how you eat, what you eat, when you eat. But let's actually get real about looking at how we can improve the bloating so that you feel better in your body. You feel more energized day to day. You feel better in your skin. And that's a much more fruitful, helpful conversation than us continually coming back to, no, it's everything to do with your weight. It's everything to do with that outward appearance. You look in the mirror, you don't like what you see, your inner critic wakes up. You know, everything you're trying to do is coming from the weight loss perspective. But actually, if we're able to park that, we can then start to have much more useful conversation.
But a lot of things come into not liking how you look in the mirror, and it's not necessarily weight. You know, muscle weighs more than fat. So there are times when I've got on the scales and I'm like, how is this? I haven't lost any weight, but like I've barely eaten anything this week and I've exercised 4 times this week. And it's actually, when I look at it, I can see, you know, my calf muscles are stronger, they're more defined, or like my arms are more defined, and that will be weight from muscle rather than weight from fat. Posture, you know, I have learned a lot recently about posture, and that kind of hunching that we get from being on our phones and that sort of thing. If you pull that all back a bit, not only are you giving your brain, your subconscious, you know, that elevated confidence, but also it's pulling everything backwards, including, you know, your core and everything. And you do look different in the mirror. You know, the way that you dress will affect how you feel about it. There's all these contributing factors.
Yeah, because it's training the brain, isn't it, it's training the brain to see things differently. You know, we're all programmed with that negative bias, aren't we? And what I think is interesting about the bloating conversation is that actually, if we feel in pain and we're bloated, that draws our attention to that part of our body, which we then look at and go, oh, I hate it because it's fat and I've got rolls that I didn't have before. And whereas actually, if you can improve how you feel in your body, then the brain is not then homing in on that particular area of the body, which, as you say, is stopping somebody from looking at their whole body and saying, well, there are bits of my body that I feel I like less, but I really like my eyes, or I really like my hair, or I really like, you know, the way that my that my arms look, or whatever. You know, we're just trained to home in on the bits that we feel that we're judging the most. And there are so many ways in which we can change that perspective, aren't there?
So in your opinion, through what you do with nutrition and menopause, and also obviously your background as well with eating disorders and mental health relations, how do you think that we can change this perception, especially that younger generations are getting with so much exposure to social media and that sort of thing? How can we help women, you know, who are coming up to the menopause or going through the menopause, to make them more confident beforehand, more prepared for what's coming?
Well, there's so much, isn't there? But I think probably the first thing that speaks to this conversation around how we see our sense of self is that we really think about the triggers that make us feel worse about ourselves, right? So the kind of diet that we're consuming on social media is something that we can have control over. You know, if we are constantly following accounts and getting shown material with the classic sort of before and after shots, if we are being fed, excuse the pun, you know, material whereby they are suggesting that we go on very restrictive dietary regimes to achieve these supposed healthier, more superior bodies, you know, we know all of that stuff is misguided, it's misinformed, it's pulling the wool over our eyes in terms of the absolute nuance and complexity to this topic. But we can take control over what we see and what we consume. So I think that's something that we have to realise has an impact on our mental health and how we view ourselves. I also think the scale is unhelpful. I think we are, again, taught that the scale is a measure of health and of all these other things, but it really isn't. So I don't think we should be using the scale really in any way to inform our health or our actions. And we've just got to give women the opportunity to see the nuance and the fact that this stuff is not black and white and it is not their fault. Weight stigma, we're not going to fix overnight. But even raising people's awareness that weight stigma is a thing that they are being exposed to in lots of healthcare appointments, and that that's not okay, is an important step, I think, to take, you know?
Do you think, obviously, we've spoken before about kind of disordered eating, and I've always avoided with the journals and even to a certain extent in conversation, kind of approaching the subject matter of food for fear of making someone worse. Would you suggest, you know, if I was going to create something for women going through the change of life, that I avoid the dietary side of things, or is there a safe way to
I
include
think
it?
it's a tricky one, because I do encourage my clients to do food journals, and we're doing that to build what we call interoceptive awareness. So our ability to recognize body cues like hunger and fullness, for example, really gets switched off. A, if we've dieted for a number of years. B, if we've got lots of menopausal symptoms that really sort of cloud our ability to tune in. So if we're sleep deprived, if we've got more stress in our lives, if we've got symptoms that are affecting our quality of life, then all of those things make us much more primal, and it's much harder to really tune into what is my body's need right now, because everything is just so much more reactive and so much more emotional. So building interoceptive awareness, getting this trust back again in hunger and fullness cues is really key. But the challenge with it is doing it with the right support. So I've run group programs where I've introduced the concept of monitoring. I've talked through the hunger fullness dial. I've explained exactly how we use it. I've made sure that I've made a clear distinction between this is not a food diary, or this is not a MyFitnessPal kind of you're going to log everything, we're going to toss it all up. It's not that kind of journaling. This is to get curious, this is to learn, this is to listen, this is to build that mind-body connection. It's incredibly helpful to do. But even in that group setting where I'm the one that's setting the scene and giving all of that information, they didn't do it very well. And that's because taking the time to record your food intake is a bit annoying and boring and, you know, frustrating, and we've got to sort of see the benefit of it and want to do it. But you've also then got to be guided with what you then do with the information that you've collected. Because as we know, this is why you've steered away from it, we've got to be quite careful, haven't we? Because if you're recording all of this stuff and then you're looking back at it and all it's then doing is raising your inner critic and making you super paranoid and super judgy about what you're eating, then you've not achieved anything. So there is mileage in doing it, and I think there's a way of setting the scene to say, this is not food journaling, this is not, you know, keeping a food diary with the classic kind of pages of like breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever. I don't think you would need to be prescriptive. I think there's a way to set the scene to say, actually raising your awareness of what your food habits are and how they relate to hunger. Do they relate, in fact, at all to your ability to recognise when you're hungry, when you're full? If you don't know how to do that, if that's actually a really tricky thing, you're probably going to need some more support with that. If you notice that lots of your eating actually doesn't really relate to physical hunger and it relates much more to emotional need or anxiety or stress, you're going to need some more support with that. So I think there's a way to do it where you can say, these are the sorts of themes that people notice when they monitor. This is what can happen and this is why, and again contextualize self-compassion. This is normal, this is what happens, but I think you need to be really careful that, like we said, this is not just a food journal that you're going to, as you say, in the kind of the more classic, weight loss plan kind of journaling where people are like, yes, I'm going to write down everything I eat and then I'm going to scrutinize it and then I'm going to tell myself off for having a biscuit. It's not that. And some people are very good reflectors and they are able to get curious and dial down the critic and dial up the compassion and, really kind of like, oh yeah, what am I learning? Let's get inquisitive. What do I notice? Oh, well, I noticed that I don't really have a proper lunch and then I finish the kids' tea and then I'm eating a bag of crisps at 9 o'clock at night. Well, that's probably actually because I've just not really fueled myself very well at breakfast. Or actually, I didn't eat breakfast at all today. And lunch was, grabbed between appointments and it didn't really amount to much. And, is it any wonder, therefore, that I've got these habits that feel out of control after 5 o'clock in the afternoon? It's incredibly powerful when you start to see patterns. But they've also got to be able to come at it with curiosity and not judgment.
That's the thing, and I think the difference kind of between what you do and what I do, obviously putting aside the specialities, is, you work with people one-on-one, you get to know them and who they are. With what I do, it's kind of a more broader spectrum of people that are using these resources for mental health issues. So the education side and sitting down and talking with you, I think will benefit many, many people. I don't think it's going to be necessarily helpful for everyone because I don't have that one-on-one, so I can't monitor who is using it and how they are using it. And with, eating disorders and disordered eating being as prevalent as it is, it might just be a little bit too dangerous.
That's what we're kind of talking about here, because remember, all of these women don't trust themselves. That's why they're looking at the diet industry to give them the answers, because they have no trust in their own body. So part of the mental health conversation is building validation in yourself and building trust in your decisions. And we don't second guess ourselves when we are assured that we are making good decisions because we've got the training or we've got the information that we need. And of course, with dieting, all the information contradicts itself. And the one thing that really can tell us what we need, which is our own body, we don't trust it. So I think it is such an important element that it probably needs to be mentioned, but I don't know that you want to go as far as to sort of be saying, and here's the journal to be doing that.
Looking at it at a different perspective.
But sort of being able to give the information about, and almost actually you could say, like, why this journal is not giving you food diary pages. It's kind of, it is really important to build trust in our bodies again, but our food relationships can often be quite complicated by the time we get to our 40s. And for this reason, it's worth investing in some support with that.
We've already talked about all of these learned behaviours that have happened over the years and have been ingrained, and not just in women, in men as well. How do we go about undoing that negative thought pattern, especially when it starts so young? It's not just that some people grow up being told by parents, by friends, by teachers, that you're not good at this, or you need to lose weight, or, And it might not even be intentional. It could be, try harder next time. And that message of, well, I didn't try hard enough this time. And then as you grow up, you move those negative messages onto yourself, and you're looking in the mirror and, I'm not worthy. I don't like this. I'm not very good at that. I've been told. And then you start telling yourself that. How can we go about breaking that cycle, especially later on in life?
I think we just get trapped in these thought loops, don't we, that just are repeated so often that they become fact. And we just need to start to breathe a bit of space into that, and to realise that we don't have to believe everything we think. And we are not necessarily going to get rid of these thoughts. And I think that's where people get a bit lost with it. Sometimes they think, well, I can't think differently. That's a very difficult ask. I can't just get rid of these thoughts. But what we're breathing space into is, but you can hear those thoughts, and you can ask, are they helpful? Are they accurate? Are they true? And do I act based upon them? Or is this an opportunity to hear those thoughts, but to say, actually, I'm not sure that's really true. I'm not sure I've got evidence for that. And I choose to not let that thought dictate what I do next.
There are therapies that are coming to light that are helping with those negative thought patterns. Your CBT, hypnotherapy, NLP.
When we're talking about body image and weight, I've had clients who have done courses of CBT, but actually it's very difficult because they're being taught how to have more helpful trains of thought, etc. But they're still very much being told that being the weight they are is a bad thing, that they do need to do something about. So they're getting very conflicting
mixed messaging.
And actually, to heal from diet culture is the starting point, and to realise that it is not your fault if you are continuing to gain weight and you keep going back on diet after diet after diet. Dieting is the strongest predictor of somebody gaining weight over time. So the process here is, again, to breathe the space into that and to say, well, it's not helpful for me to keep, that narrative going that this is my fault. This is not my fault. What can I do? What is within my control? How do I want to act in service of my well-being and my health today?
Like you said with that woman who, if I lose X amount of weight, everything else will fall into place. Well, actually, I think the conversation and the reality of what we're talking about is, if we change our frame of mind, then everything else will fall into place. There is a question that I want to ask you. It's a bit off the cuff of what the seriousness of what we've been talking about, but what is your opinion on restaurants bringing in menus that have calories on them?
I know. It's such a tough one, isn't it? Because is there a subset of the population for whom that's just quite educational and quite interesting? And if somebody is thinking, well, I want to, eat in a healthy, balanced way, I'd either have, this meal or this meal. Oh, wow, that one's got, 1,000 calories in it, and that one's only got 600 calories in it. Well, I don't mind which one I have, and I'll go for the one that's got 600 calories. It would be nice to think that we're all having these very sort of informative, surface level, oh, how fascinating, thank you so much for providing me with this insight type conversation. But that in reality is not, I don't think, what's happening, because we know that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people out there whose brains are trained around calories. It's a language that they've grown up with. It is incredibly toxic. It detaches them from actually listening, as we said, to their own body signals and body cues. It doesn't even talk about the health of a food, as we know, right? So those sorts of people are going to find those sorts of values on menus incredibly triggering, either one way or the other, right? Either in what their behaviour is after they've had the food, if they go into that with, you know, I don't care, what the hell, but then they choose to then give themselves a hard time about it later, or that they then use that menu to manipulate themselves into a, you know, a food choice that they don't even want, but they're choosing it because it's the lowest calorie thing on the menu, and then they sit there and they have a really unsatisfying lunch that hasn't really filled them up and is, you know, not even very tasty, and then they end up gorging in the evening because they're over hungry and their brain is really unsatisfied with or dissatisfied, with what it's been given that day.
Exactly. And I actually had this exact conversation in a restaurant last night with friends. And for me, especially going out and eating, it's an experience. Usually it's a social experience. It's something that you look forward to. For some people, it's a bit of a treat, especially if there's budget restraints. You're likely going to be there with friends or family, and it is food, and going out is an experience. And the calories being on menus, I think mentally it ruins that experience to a certain extent, because you are taken away from the enjoyment and you are moved into this negative pattern of thinking again, and you are absorbed with what you are eating rather than who you are eating with and what you are enjoying. I've seen people before who have binge eat and then do a huge amount of exercise. And I think the whole conversation with calories being on menus, you know, all that is doing is, yes, it's taken away from the experience. It's taken the trust away from you. You're now trusting the restaurant's guidelines rather than what you would like and what you feel like eating and what would soothe you at that time. And you could be giving yourself extra things to do in the evening. Well, I will treat myself to that, but I'll have a run when I get home.
Yes, exactly. Earning it, exactly.
I've taken like loads of notes of key things that you've said, and what this is going to give me is I can now go home and look at it in a different light, because I think I'm used to creating things which are very trackery, and trying to find causes of things. With this, we already know the cause, especially like if it's menopause related. We already know the cause. We already know it's out of our control. So what resource is going to help make these women feel like they have a bit more control? And I think I'm going to angle it more towards mentally them understanding their body and their frame of mind.
I think that's the key thing. It's like, what is the purpose of doing this? It's kind of, it's to enable reflective practice, but it's also to enable them to join some dots that they might not otherwise previously do. Joining the dots, I think, for these women is so key, because otherwise they're floating around in this kind of sense of something's not right, but I can't put my finger on it, for a long time. And actually you want them to feel like they've got, you know, empowerment to live in service of their needs, right?
Yeah, and I think the way that my journals will already help is they cover the kind of anxiety side of it, the mental health side of it. But one thing, the reason I wanted to create a resource for women going through the menopause is partly to get a bit of that empowerment back, be able to see compassionately that this is it's a change. It's not an end. It's a change. And feel like they have a bit more control over that mindset. But also, I don't want these women to feel forgotten, because I think menopause has been kind of hastily pushed behind things and hidden for so many years. And creating a resource that's specifically for women and addressing their concerns and their mental health, and how they feel about themselves during this stage of life will be a huge benefit, because there aren't that many resources out there, not physical resources for women going through the menopause, and obviously it's a huge percentage of the population. It's not something that just comes and goes, it's generational. I don't want them to feel forgotten. I want them to feel like there are people out there that are trying, that are learning, that are producing things that are going to be of use and of benefit for them. And I think I want this resource to be something that gives them empowerment, not something that drags out reminders of the symptoms and the hard times, something that's going to be a support, not a reminder.
Yeah, absolutely.